Hello, Universe. I'm gonna talk about something as old as the 1960s and as new as the 2300s. I'm gonna talk about Star Trek. It's April 5th. It's the negative 47th annual Star Trek First Contact Day. So let's take a look at the universe of Star Trek. And to be precise, if we're gonna talk about anything to do with Star Trek or First Contact, let's talk about the device that got the attentions of the Vulcans, causing that ancient and advanced species known as the Vulcans to come and publicly encounter and meet with humans for the first time, bringing Earth to the galaxy, or the galaxy to Earth. We're talking about warp drive, most common form of faster than light travel in the Star Trek universe. Alright, so we're going to talk about warp engineering, but not the usual thing about subspace and how the ship might be able to take advantage of subspace shortcuts under certain circumstances, or any of the things like that. I'm going to talk about some of the unspoken things that are right in plain sight, such as the benefit of positioning the Bussard collectors in a certain position, and of course the line of sight rule. The rarely spoken of line of sight rule that determines the best positioning for warp nacelles. Alright, why am I looking at some dusty Star Trek models on a scratched up coffee table? Well, I want to talk about warp engineering. Yep, I'm going to talk about warp engineering. Well, just a small detail of it. Such as why the warp nacelles get positioned where they are, and of course the Bussard collectors. This applies to the Starfleet design in Star Trek. One thing you might notice, with the NX class starship over here, just like the Constitution class, Kirk's ship, Archer's earlier starship, the warp nacelles are raised up above the ship a bit. So, yeah, on this angle. There's a good reason for that. Oh, and there the models fell off the stand. Worry about too much anymore. These warp nacelles are raised up above the ship a bit. There we go. And is there any reason for that? The front of the nacelles are supposedly equipped with Bussard collectors. Basically, they draw in hydrogen, traces of hydrogen from the vacuum of space, and the ship can convert it into fuel. So that's a useful feature. You wouldn't want that directly behind the saucer section, nothing obstructing them from the empty space ahead of the ship, because empty space isn't perfectly empty. It does contain very rarefied traces of hydrogen. So that's why you wouldn't want it right behind the ship. But why not just extend the pylons out side by side so that they're beside the ship? Wouldn't that be a more balanced design? That's something I often thought of when I looked at Star Trek starships. One of the rules of the design of Star Trek ships, I'm tempted to say one of the rules of warp engineering, one of the rules of Star Trek starship designs is, whenever possible, the warp nacelles should have line of sight with each other. And these do. If they were just straight out from the ship and not raised up above it or tilted below it, then basically the same pylons that hold them in place would be an obstruction and they wouldn't be in line of sight of each other. So by raising them up a bit, rather than extending them out past the sides of the ship, it actually allows for them to have a line of sight. Now, this isn't a complete rule with Star Trek starships. While it's obvious that most Federation ships follow this rule, in fact, the big Romulan warbirds of Star Trek The Next Generation, if you notice, they're basically designed with a big open space in the middle of the ship. They're huge, but those warp nacelles, which are placed evenly at the sides of the ship, they are in line of sight with each other with empty space in between them. And let's see. The Galaxy class starship, those warp nacelles, except for the Bussard collectors at the front, line of sight with each other, and yeah, that just came off. Well, that ship is not going to be going into warp anytime soon. And actually, two warp nacelles. So two warp nacelles placed in a line of sight with each other apparently is an efficiency issue. Of course, some starships like the Defiant, you might notice that ship and some other ships don't always follow that rule perfectly. In the case of the Defiant, I think it's an actual issue of efficiency more than anything. The Defiant is designed as a small ship with a very powerful engine, so this efficiency issue wouldn't apply, at least not as much so. And the Defiant is very compact, making it harder to hit by enemies, and also making it better armored in combat, because the Defiant was one of the few Federation starships designed with combat in mind. It's sometimes referred to as a heavy escort. But this NX class starship, it would have to be designed very efficiently, because the warp engine it used was very new, so this does make sense. This is a rational design for that starship. It also is a rational design that the Akira class starship would be similar. The Akira class has a lot of weapons. I think it carries a lot of shuttles. It's designed to get into emergency situations fast and quick, and also be a fairly efficiently designed ship. So it would stand to reason that it too would have a very simple design. It's almost like an upside down NX class starship. There's a lot of differences though. Well, with the NX, that ship would have to be a very efficient design, the most efficient design they could come up with at the time, because the Warp 5 engine was not incredibly powerful, but it was the best they could do at the time, but they needed to put it to the best use possible to make space travel convenient. Now the Akira was coming out at a time when the Borg have become a threat, the Dominion Wars were just beginning, and it had to be a very quick and efficient design to get into emergency situations with, well, lots of weapons and lots of shuttlecraft too. So there's an efficiency issue. And of course with the Phoenix, I think the Phoenix's warp nacelles went out pretty much straight off of its sides. So I suppose they hadn't discovered that rule of efficiency, or the line of sight rule yet, when they first developed warp drive, that first test ship. And so it's not an absolute rule. Obviously some starships don't have line of sight between their warp nacelles, but whenever possible, they're supposed to have it. Now the fact that I'm referring to all this as an efficiency issue, that's just theory on my part, because obviously not all ships follow the rule that you have to have an even number of warp nacelles and they have to have a line of sight with each other. Not all ships follow that rule, so I'm just putting out a theory that it's an efficiency issue. I guess they just don't have it when it gets in the way of other design priorities. Why Star Trek starship designers design the ships the way they do. It's not that often spoken of. On rare occasions you'll see an odd number of warp nacelles. That supposedly also violates the rule of 2 warp nacelles in line of sight, or 4 warp nacelles with line of sight. But, as I said, the rule isn't always in play. Different designs call for different situations. And it is a very common design to have 2 warp nacelles with line of sight. Now, if you want to check out more videos, UniMultiVerse Archives, Star Trek and Star Wars Cosmic Evolution, Archive 1. In that one, I mispronounced the Celestials as the Celestials. Worth comparing, the organic ancestors of the Q that created the Guardian of Forever, as stated in some of the Star Trek novels. You could take that forward to the Q themselves being responsible for the Iconians getting their hands on a similar technology that resulted in the creation of gateways, kind of like stargates, and the Celestials having a similar effect on a species of blue reptile humanoids that were also the first contact of the Rakata in the Star Wars universe. Then there's the Neo Retro News for 2015 October. That one's pretty heavily Halloween themed, but for one brief moment, the video does jokingly consider the possibility that the humans in the Star Wars universe were abducted by the Rakata from the Star Trek universe. And then there's also some video logs, such as one where I talk about my all-time favorite television show, Star Trek Enterprise. Anyway, happy Star Trek Day. Happy First Contact Day.